economic interests than were the different parts of the major civilization. Chapter 1. On some characteristics of Germany's historical development. Generally speaking, the tragedy of the German people lies in the fact that it entered into the modern bourgeois line of development too late. But this is too much of a generalization and needs to be made historically concrete. For historical processes are extraordinarily complicated and contradictory, and it can be said of neither an early nor a late entry per se that one is better than the other. We have only to look at the bourgeois democratic revolutions. On the one hand, the English and French peoples gained a big lead over the Germans through fighting out their bourgeois democratic revolutions in the 17th century and at the end of the 18th respectively. But, on the other hand, it was precisely as a result of its retarded capitalist development that the Russian nation managed to transfer its bourgeois democratic revolution to the proletarian one, thereby sparing itself sorrows and conflicts which still exist in the German nation today. We must always take into account, therefore, the concrete interaction of socio-historical tendencies. But with these reservations, we shall find that the decisive factor in the modern history of Germany to date lies here, in the delayed development of capitalism with all its social, political and ideological consequences. The major European peoples formed themselves into nations at the start of the modern period. They constructed unified national territories to replace feudal fragmentation, and there sprang up a national economy pervading and uniting the entire people, a national culture that was unified in spite of all class divisions. In the development of the bourgeois class and its struggle with feudalism, it was always absolute monarchy which came into temporary being as the executive organ of this unification. It was in this period of transition that Germany began to pursue a different, opposite course. This is by no means to suggest that it was able to withdraw from all the exigencies of the general capitalist line of development in Europe and grow into a nation in a wholly unique manner, as was claimed by reactionary historians and the fascist historians after them. Germany, as the young Marx so vividly put it, shared the sorrows of this development without sharing in its pleasures, its partial satisfaction. And to this observation he added the prophetic forecast, hence one fine day, Germany will find herself on the level of the European decline before ever having reached the level of European emancipation. To be sure, mining, industry and commerce grew profusely in Germany at the end of the Middle Ages and the start of the modern period, but more slowly than in England, France or Holland. As Engels points out, a major disadvantage of the German development of that period was that the different domains were less strongly linked by unified economic interests than were the different parts of the major civilized countries of the West. For instance, the Hanseatic League's trading interests in the North and Baltic Seas were virtually unrelated to the interests of centers of trade in southern and central Germany. In these circumstances, the rerouting of trade passages which followed the discovery of America and the sea route to India and stopped goods passing through Germany in transit was bound to be particularly disastrous in its effects, although here too the class struggles were waged with religious slogans. Western Europe was firmly taking the road to capitalism, to the economic underpinning and ideological evolution of bourgeois society. But Germany, at this precise moment, was preserving all the wretchedness associated with the transition from the medieval to the modern epoch. Indeed, the misery in which the resulting reaction in Germany was bogged down was further increased by elements absorbed within the country from the social content of this transition. The causes of this were the conversion of the larger feudal domains into an absolutism, on the duodecimo pattern but without its progressive side, viz., assistance in reinforcing the bourgeois class, and heightened forms of peasant exploitation. For while the latter did create in Germany, as in the original accumulation of the West, a class of vagabonds, a broad stratum of socially deracinated lives, they could not possibly, since no manufactory existed, permit the development of pre-proletarian plebeians. The deracinated remained a lumpen proletariat, raw material for mercenary and brigandish activities. All these factors meant that from the beginning of the 16th century, the great class struggles had a completely different character and, above all, quite different consequences in Germany from those they had elsewhere in the West. Ideologically, this amounts to saying that the humanist movement contributed far less to the origin of a national consciousness in Germany than elsewhere. It also had far less influence on the development of a uniform national formal or written language. It is altogether typical of Germany's situation at the time that it was just here that the religio-ideological movement of the transitional era gained the greatest preponderance over secular humanism, and did so an extremely important point in its socially most backward form. For it is almost a platitude not only among Marxists but also, since Max Weber and Troeltsch, in bourgeois sociology, that the origins of the Reformation are linked very closely with those of capitalism. But the Reformation provided the banner for the first major bourgeois revolutions inside Holland and England in its Western, Calvinist form. This became the ruling ideology in the first period of burgeoning capitalism. The Lutheranism, which became uppermost in Germany, on the other hand, offered a religious transfiguration of subjection to Kleinstaat absolutism and supplied a spiritual background, a moral foundation for Germany's economic, social and cultural backwardness. Naturally, this ideological development is only a reflection of those class struggles which decided the country's way of life and direction of growth for centuries to come. We are referring to the conflicts which reached their height in the Peasants' War of 1525. The significance which this revolution, and more, especially the crushing of it, took on for Germany's destiny illuminates from a fresh angle that general economic state of affairs we have just discussed. All major peasant risings at the close of the Middle Ages were twice-sided movements. On the one side, there were the defensive struggles of a peasantry in retreat, still yoked to feudal values and seeking to regain positions of the transitional golden age, now lost forever on the economic plane as a result of the unleashing of capitalist forces of production. And on the other, we have the more or less callow vanguard actions of the imminent bourgeois democratic revolution. The special situation of Germany as we have portrayed it entailed two things. It meant that both aspects of the peasant revolts received greater prominence in the Peasants' War than otherwise. I refer you, to underline the progressive component, to Wendell Hitler's reform program for the Reich and to the plebeian movement under Thomas Müntzer. It meant also that the loss of that war had irremediably disastrous results. What the Kaiser was incapable of doing, the peasants' revolution sought to accomplish, the unification of Germany and liquidation of the constantly consolidating feudal absolutist centrifugal tendencies. These very forces were bound to gain strength from the peasants' defeat. A modernized feudalism superseded a purely feudal fragmentation, the petty princes, as victors and profiteers in the class, struggles, stabilized Germany's divided condition. And thus, like Italy from other causes, Germany became an impotent complex of petty, formerly independent states as a result of the crushing of the first major revolutionary wave, the Reformation and Peasants' War. As such, it was now the object of the politics of the emerging capitalist world, the great, absolute monarchies. Mighty nation-states, Spain, France, England, the House of Habsburg and Austria, ephemeral major powers like Sweden and also, from the 18th century, Tsarist Russia were to decide the fate of the German people. And since Germany, as a political pawn of theirs, was at the same time a useful object of exploitation, these countries saw to it that her national fragmentation was preserved for years to come in becoming the battleground and victim of the conflicting interests of the major European powers. Germany went to the wall economically and culturally as well as politically. This general decay was manifested not only in the universal impoverishment and ravaging of the country, in the backward development of both agricultural and industrial production, and the regression of once flourishing towns, etc., but also in the cultural physiognomy of the whole German people. It took no part in the great economic and cultural upsurge of the 16th and 17th centuries. Its masses, including the mass of the emergent bourgeois intelligentsia, lagged far behind the development of the major civilized countries. The reasons were primarily material ones, but they were determined by certain ideological characteristics of the German development as well. Firstly, there was the incredible pettiness, narrowness and short-sightedness of life in the small German duchies compared to England or France. Secondly, and closely connected with this, there was the far greater and more tangible dependence of the subjects on the monarch and his bureaucratic machinery, the far more restricted scope for an ideologically hostile or merely critical attitude than elsewhere. A further point is that Lutheranism, and later on, Pietism, etc. limited this scope in the subjective sense also, converting external subjection into an inner submissiveness and thus breeding that underdog mentality which Engels termed servile. There was, of course, a reciprocal influence in play here, but one which constantly diminished the scope for protest both objectively and subjectively. Accordingly, the Germans could have no hand either in bourgeois revolutionary movements which aimed at replacing governance through absolute monarchy, not yet realized for a unified Germany, with a higher political form better suited to capitalism in its more advanced stages. The petty states, whose existence the rival major powers were artificially conserving, could exist only as hirelings of those powers. To resemble their great models outwardly, they could maintain themselves only on the most ruthless and retrograde draining of the working people. Naturally no rich, independent and powerful bourgeoisie will spring up in such a country, and no progressive revolutionary intelligentsia to match the bourgeois and petty bourgeois classes were economically much more dependent on the courts than elsewhere in Western Europe. Hence there developed among them a servility, a petty, mean and wretched spirit hardly to be found in other European countries at this time. And with economic development stagnant, there was in Germany little or no trace of those plebeian groupings outside the feudal hierarchy of estates, which constituted the most important propulsive force in the revolutions of the modern period now dawning. In the Peasants' War they still played a crucial role under Munzer. Now they comprised, where they existed at all, a servile and venal social stratum that was declining into a lumpen proletariat. Certainly, Germany's bourgeois revolution at the start of the 16th century created an ideological foundation for a national culture in the uniform modern written language. But this too underwent a regression, becoming crabbed and barbarized in this period of profound national humiliation. Not until the 18th century, especially in its second half, did an economic recovery set in. And it went hand in hand with an economic and cultural strengthening of the bourgeois class. The bourgeoisie, however, was still far too weak to remove the obstacles to national unity, or indeed even to raise this question in serious political terms. But the backwardness was beginning to be generally sensed, a national feeling was awakening, and the longing for national unity was constantly growing, although there was no chance of political associations with specific programs on this basis, even on a local scale. Nevertheless, the economic necessity of bourgeoisement was appearing more and more forcefully in the feudal absolutist petty states that class compromise in, which Engels saw the social stamp of the status quo in Germany, as late as the 1840s, was starting to take shape between the nobility and the petty bourgeoisie, with the former playing the leading part. Its form was bureaucratization, which, here as everywhere else in Europe, became a transitional form of the dissolution of feudalism, of the bourgeoisie's struggle for political power. Granted, this process of German fragmentation into largely helpless petty states again took very lowly forms, and the essence of the compromise between nobility and petty bourgeoisie was that the former occupied the higher and the latter the lower bureaucratic posts. But despite these mean and backward forms of social and political life, the German middle class was starting to arm itself for the power struggle, at least in the ideological sense. After having been cut off from progressive movements in the West, it was now making contact with the English and French Enlightenment, digesting it and even in part amplifying it of its own accord. It was in this state that Germany spent the period of the French and Napoleonic revolutions. From the political angle, the German people was still the object of the rival power blocs, the modern bourgeois world emerging in France and the feudal absolutist Central and Eastern European powers ranged against it with English support. The great events of the period hastened to a remarkable extent the development and growing consciousness of the bourgeois class, fanning the flames of national unity more strongly than ever. At the same time, however, the politically fateful consequences of fragmentation were emerging more sharply than ever. In Germany there were still, objectively speaking, no unified national politics. Large sections of the avant-garde bourgeois intellectuals welcomed the French Revolution with enthusiasm. Kant, Herder, Berger, Hegel, Hölderlin, etc. and contemporary documents such as Goethe's travel reports show that this enthusiasm was by no means limited to the celebrated top minds of the middle class but had roots in broader sectors of the class itself. All the same, it was impossible for the democratic revolutionary movement to spread even in the more advanced west of Germany. Although Mainz joined the French Republic, it remained totally isolated, and its downfall at the hands of the Austro-Prussian army evoked no echo in the rest of Germany. The leader of the Mainz Rising, the important scholar and humanist Georg Forster, died as an exile in Paris. Forgotten and neglected, this fragmentation was repeated on a larger scale in the Napoleonic period. Napoleon succeeded in finding supporters and allies in the west and south of Germany and also, in part, in central Germany, Saxony, and he was aware that this alliance, the Rhineland, could only be assured of any degree of survival if the dissolution of feudalism was at least embarked on in the states supporting him. This happened to a large extent in the Rhinelands, far less so in the other states of the Rhineland. Even as reactionary, chauvinistic a historian as Treitschke was forced to observe of the Rhineland, the old order was abolished without trace, the chance of restoring it went begging. Soon even the memory of Kleinstadt times evaporated. The history which is a really living memory in the hearts of the rising generation of Rhinelanders only began with the incursion of the French, but since Napoleon's power was not sufficient to reduce the whole of Germany to a similar dependence on the French Empire, the country's fragmentation was only rendered still deeper and stronger. In consequence, Napoleonic rule was felt by broad sectors of the people to be an oppressive foreign domination. To combat it there started, especially in Prussia, a national popular movement which reached a climax in the so-called Wars of Liberation. Germany's political fragmentation was matched by her ideological disunion. The leading progressive thinkers of the age, notably Goethe and Hegel, sympathized with the Napoleonic unification of Germany and a liquidation carried out from France of the relics of feudalism. In accordance with the problematical inner nature of this view, the concept of the nation dwindled in these thinkers to a mere cultural idea, as is best seen in the Phenomenology of Man. But just as full of contradictions was the thinking of the political and military leaders of the Wars of Liberation, who sought a release from the yoke of France and the creation of a German nation by way of a Prussian uprising in league with Austria and Russia. Men like Stein, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau wanted to introduce the social and military benefits of the French Revolution because they saw clearly that only an army organized on such lines could take up the contest with Napoleon. But they not only wished to achieve this without a revolution, they also wanted, through continual compromises, to accommodate Prussia, albeit a Prussia reformed by them too. The feudal leftovers and the classes representing the leftovers economically and ideologically. This yielding to Germany's current backwardness was forced upon them, but at the same time the agents of the process transfigured it ideologically. One of the consequences of accommodation was that the longing for national liberation and unity often turned into a narrow chauvinism, a blind and petty Francophobia, and it also failed to produce a real ideology of liberation among the masses now mobilized. This was especially the case in that there was no avoiding an alliance with those circles of reactionary romanticism which interpreted the anti-Napoleonic struggle as a struggle for the complete restoration of conditions existing before the French Revolution. Naturally, such contradictions were also manifest in the philosopher of this trend, Fichte. In his later years, although he was much more radical in the political and social sense than many of the national movement's political and military leaders, there was, then, a profound disunion within the spiritual and political leadership of the German people and a very widespread ideological confusion with regard to the aims and methods of the campaign for national unity. Yet, in spite of it all, national unity became the object demanded by a large mass movement embracing important sectors of the German people during this period for the first time since the Peasants' War. Thereupon the issue of national unity became, as Lenin first clearly formulated it, the central question of the German bourgeois revolution. If we consider German history in the 19th century, we can assure ourselves at every stage of the truth and accuracy of Lenin's observation. The struggle for national unity did indeed govern the whole political and ideological development of 19th century Germany. And the particular form in which this question was finally solved left its stamp on the whole of German intellectual life from the 1850s to the present day. Herein lies the fundamental singularity of Germany's development. and it may be readily seen that this axis around which everything revolves is no more than a consequence of its retarded, capitalist development. The other major nations of the West, especially England and France, had already attained to national unity under an absolute monarchy, that is, in their cases, national unity was one of the first products of the class conflicts between bourgeois and feudal life. In Germany, on the other hand, the bourgeois revolution had first to fight for national unity and lay its cornerstones. Only Italy experienced a similar development. Moreover, its intellectual consequences show, despite all the historical differences between the two countries, a certain affinity which has had notorious repercussions in the very recent past. Particular historical circumstances, into which we cannot go in detail now, also dictated the realization of national unity under an absolute monarch in Russia and the revolutionary movement's development in Russia. The Russian Revolution showed too all the consequences that will arise in such circumstances, consequences basically different from those obtaining in Germany. Accordingly, in countries where national unity is already a product of earlier class struggles under absolute monarchy, the task of bourgeois democratic revolution consists only of completing this work, of more or less purging the national state of existing feudal and absolutist bureaucratic leftovers, and of aligning it with the purposes of bourgeois society. This happened in England through a gradual reconstruction of the older national institutions, and in France through a revolutionary transformation of the bureaucratic feudal character of the state machinery. Naturally, there were serious relapses here in periods of reaction, but there was no impairing or jeopardizing of the national sense of unity. Class struggles lasting for centuries had laid this foundation, which left bourgeois democratic revolutions with the advantage that the accomplishment of national unity, its adaptation to the exigencies of modern bourgeois society, could form an organic and fruitful link with the revolutionary struggle against feudalism's economic and social institutions. The peasant question as the core of bourgeois revolution in France and Russia. It may be readily seen that for Germany, the differently shaped central question of bourgeois democratic revolution created a whole series of unfavorable circumstances. Revolution would have to shatter at one blow institutions whose gradual undermining and demolition had taken centuries of class struggles. In, for instance, France, it would have to produce at a stroke those central national institutions and bodies which in England or Russia were the products of a development lasting centuries. But this not only made the objective task harder to solve. The central revolutionary proposition also had an unfavorable effect on the attitude of the different classes to the problem, and created constellations obstructing the radical execution of bourgeois democratic revolution. We shall just pick out a few of the most important factors. Above all, there was a manifold blurring of the sharp antithesis between the feudal leftovers, the monarchy and its machinery, as well as the nobility, and the bourgeois class, because the more strongly capitalism develops, the greater the need will become, even for classes interested in preserving the remnants of feudalism, to realize national unity, their own version of it, that is. Let us take as a prime example Prussia's role in the creation of national unity. Objectively, Prussia's particular constitution was always the greatest hindrance to a real national unity, and yet that unity was attained with Prussian bayonets. And from the wars of liberation to the creation of the German Empire, the bourgeois revolutionaries were always confused and misled by the question of whether national unification was to be reached with the aid of Prussian military power or by crushing it. From the standpoint of Germany's democratic development, the second course would unquestionably have been the commendable one, but for crucial sections of the German middle class, Especially in Prussia, there was available a convenient road of class compromise, and escape from the extreme plebeian consequences of bourgeois democratic revolution, and therefore the possibility of achieving their economic goals without a revolution, albeit on the basis of a surrender of political hegemony in the new state, but equally unfavorable conditions obtained even within the bourgeois camp. The revolution's central issue was national unity, and this bolstered the hegemony of an upper middle class always inclined towards class compromises. It meant that it was less threatened than in 18th century France and 19th century Russia. To mobilize the petty bourgeois and plebeian masses against the compromise aims of the upper middle class was much harder in Germany. The prime reason for this was that the bourgeois revolution's central issue of national unity presupposed a far more highly developed awareness and alertness among the plebeian masses than did, for example, the peasant question, where the economic contrasts between different classes were incomparably more obvious and thus more immediately apparent to the plebeian masses. Because of its seemingly purely political nature, the issue of national unity often hid from sight the immediate and directly intelligible economic problems, which remain latent in the various possibilities of solving the issue. For revolutionary patriotism to turn into counter-revolutionary chauvinism was more likely here than in other bourgeois democratic upheavals, especially as the upper middle class tendencies towards class compromise and the Bismarckian Bonapartism arising after 1848 were consciously veering in this direction. But for the masses, it was harder to have a clear perception of such maneuvers before national unity had been achieved than in states where this had been taken for granted for centuries. This covering-up tendency acquired an objective shape in that the struggle for national unity, so long as the individual states that made up Germany were not elevated into union, and that was naturally the end of the process, not he start took the form of a problem of foreign affairs that involved the foreign policy of the separate states and their mutual relations and their foreign policy in relation to the external major powers which, as a result of Germany's development hitherto, were deemed entitled to intervene in her internal affairs. Clearly this supplied apparently plausible pretexts for keeping the masses, sometimes including the democratic revolutionary-minded masses, away from these decisions of foreign policy, and for driving them into a blind chauvinism. This situation presupposed in addition a far greater insight into complicated external political relations than the other central questions of bourgeois revolutions. Naturally, there is a connection between foreign and domestic affairs as far as every democratic revolution is concerned. But the insight, for instance, that court intrigues with feudal absolutist foreign powers were endangering the revolution was incomparably easier of access to the plebeian masses in the French Revolution than was the real relation between national unity and foreign policy to the German masses at the time of the 1848 revolution. Above all, it was hard for the German masses to see that a revolutionary war against Tsarist Russia would be necessary to the achievement of national unity, as Marx constantly preached with great lucidity in the Neue Rheinische Zeitung. This difficulty and the concomitant upper middle class hegemony, including that which existed with regard to class compromises and a betrayal of democratic revolution, were further reinforced by the fact that the danger facing any bourgeois revolution, viz., the turning of national wars of liberation into wars of conquest, was more imminent and fraught with still greater domestic consequences here than in bourgeois revolutions of another type. For all these reasons, the masses were far more quickly and intensively influenced by chauvinistic propaganda in Germany than in other countries. the rapid turning of a justified and revolutionary national enthusiasm into reactionary chauvinism facilitated, on the one hand, the deception of the masses at home by the upper middle class and the Junkers allied to the monarchy. And on the other hand, the democratic revolution was deprived of its most important allies. Thus in 1848, the German bourgeoisie was able to exploit the Polish question in a reactionary chauvinist spirit, while the plebeian masses again, despite timely and accurate warnings from the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, failed to put a stop to it and to convert the Poles from revolutionary Germany's natural allies into real partners in the campaign against reactionary powers on both a German and an international scale. These adverse circumstances were created by the nationally fragmented situation in which Germany found herself at the time when bourgeois democratic revolution was the issue of the day. As far as the subjective factor in the revolution is concerned, it was a disadvantage for the bourgeoisie, petty bourgeoisie, plebeian masses and proletariat to enter the revolution without political preparation. The fragmentation into petty states was extremely unfortunate for the revolutionary democratic training of the lower sections of the people, for the development of revolutionary democratic traditions among the plebeian masses. Their sole political experience consisted merely of minor and trivial local struggles within the bounds of the Kleinstaaten. The collective national interests, being abstractly suspended above those struggles, could thus very easily turn into clichés. And this clique-making by the leading bourgeois ideologists, expressed in its crudest form in the Frankfurt National Assembly, could consciously or unconsciously, deliberately or involuntarily be directed into reactionary channels with the greatest ease. A fact which helped to exacerbate this situation was that at the start of the 19th century, the South German duchies formed the center of the country's political democratic movement, so that it was precisely democratic trends which were most afflicted by this pettiness, trifling and cliché-making. To be sure, the Rhinelands, the most advanced region of Germany economically and socially, belonged to Prussia, but they formed a kind of enclave within it. They lay far away from the center of political decision-making, the Berlin of the court and petty bourgeoisie. And since the remnants of feudalism had been abolished here by Napoleon's regime, they had quite different immediate interests from the backward, still markedly feudal areas of Prussia proper. Thus a tactical consideration added to the adverse circumstances as a result of the national fragmentation. The bourgeois democratic revolution was unable to find a particularly decisive center such as Paris formed in the 18th century. The major reactionary powers, Prussia and Austria, had their concentrated bureaucratic and military power. In the face of this, the revolutionary forces were more than divided. The National Assembly sat in Frankfurt. Cologne was the center of revolutionary democracy. The critical struggles in Berlin and Vienna occurred spontaneously, without clear ideological leadership, and after the defeats in the capital cities it was possible for the movements which flared up in Dresden, the Palatinate, Ball, etc., to be put down one by one. These factors determined the destiny of democratic revolution in Germany, not only with regard to national unity but in all areas where it became necessary to abolish the feudal leftovers. Not for nothing did Lenin describe this course as internationally typical, unfavorable to the genesis of modern bourgeois society, and as the Prussian road. This observation must not only be restricted to the agrarian question in the narrower sense, but must be applied to the whole development of capitalism and the political superstructure it acquired in Germany's modern bourgeois society. Even in Germany, The feudal remnants could only slow down the spontaneous growth of capitalist production, not prevent it. Napoleon's continental blockade itself called forth a certain capitalist upsurge in Germany. But this spontaneous development of capitalism did not arise in Germany in the period of artisan labor, as it did in England or France, but in the age of modern capitalism in the real sense, and the feudal absolutist bureaucracy of Germany's petty states, above all the Prussian bureaucracy, was obliged actively to take the initiative in underpinning the capitalist development. Certainly, precisely where the crucial questions were concerned, this often happened much against its will and nearly always without the least insight into the true dimensions of what was occurring with its assistance and through its initiative. We can see this very clearly in Treich's account of the origin of the German customs union, since he always tended to idealize the political foresight and national aims of the Hohenzollern regime. His version is particularly instructive, and this development took place largely against the will of the Prussian crown itself. Here we see an inner natural force at work. Nothing was further from the mind of Friedrich Wilhelm III than to pave the way for a separation from Austria through the customs union. He regarded dualism as a blessing for the fatherland. It was in the nature of things that this should finally be reached. There thus took shape a true Germany bound by shared economic interests, whereas theory alone held sway in Frankfurt. As previously in Regensburg, Friedrich Wilhelm IV too was pro-Austria and enthused over Austria more than his own state, and nevertheless the merging of interests between non-Austrian Germany and Prussia continued inexorably. Although the Central States would gladly have crushed Prussia after 185, none of them dared to disrupt the customs union. They could no longer break free of this tie. The most interesting feature of this account is the irrationalism bordering on mysticism, the development of German capitalism, the process of asserting its elementary interests, the incomprehension and incompetence of the German petty and Prussian monarchies in the face of this process. All this Treich presents as a kind of fate tragedy. If this attitude were only typical of the historian, it would not be all that important, but here Treich was giving eminently precise intellectual expression to the general mood in Germany, whereas nations which had won their present political form through struggle regarded it as their own creation. The Germans looked on nationhood as a mysterious gift from higher irrational powers, but the Prussian course of Germany's development also had more direct consequences. Because economic unity had come about in this way, we find in capitalist circles a widespread dependence on the Prussian state from the outset, a constant making of deals with a semi-feudal bureaucracy. They entertained the prospect of asserting the bourgeoisie's economic interests in peaceful agreement with the Prussian monarchy. Hence Engels's subsequent comment that 1848 did not present the Prussian bourgeoisie with any cogent need to solve the question of power in the state by revolutionary means, but the fact that this process was belated in Germany, that it took place not in the artisan period but in that of modern capitalism, had another important consequence. Undeveloped though German capitalism was in the mid-19th century, it was no longer confronted by socially amorphous masses which could at least temporarily be lumped together with the bourgeoisie as a third estate, as the French bourgeoisie had been before the French Revolution. It faced a modern, albeit likewise undeveloped, proletariat. We can best appreciate the difference if we reflect that in France, Gracchus Babeuf instigated a rising with a consciously socialist goal only some years after Robespierre's execution, whereas in Germany the revolt of the Silesian spinners broke out 4 years before the 1848 revolution, and the first complete formulation of revolutionary proletarian ideology, the Communist Manifesto, appeared on the eve of revolution itself. This situation, derived from Germany's delayed capitalist development, produced a proletariat that was already emerging of its own accord but was as yet unable, however, to exert a decisive influence on events. The effect of international events in the class struggle made the situation acuter still. Granted, on the one hand, the February Revolution in Paris helped to spark off the revolution in Berlin and Vienna. But, on the other hand, the class struggle strongly in evidence there between bourgeoisie and proletariat had a discouraging effect on the German bourgeoisie and promoted its inclination, already present for the reasons we have stated, to compromise with the old powers, with the greatest determination. In particular, the Battle of June and its sorry outcome became an event crucial to the development of the German class struggles. From the outset, Germany lacked that irresistible unity of an anti-feudal people which had boosted the French Revolution, while at the same time the German proletariat was still too feeble to make itself the leaders of the whole nation, as did the Russian proletariat half a century later. Accordingly, the dissolution of the original anti-feudal unity ensued more quickly and went through the opposite process to the French. Admittedly, 1848 was the German equivalent of 1789. But the relationship between the bourgeoisie and the lower classes was closer to French conditions in 1830 and 1840 than to those of 1789. Hence there already appeared in 1848 a feature of the German development which became of moment for the democratic transformation of Germany in later years as well. Firstly, these democratic upheavals began where they usually ended in the classic revolutions of England and France, with the struggle against the radical plebeian proletarian wing. That, of course, was no mere difference of chronology. In the French Revolution especially we see a development going up to the farthest bounds of purely bourgeois democracy. Thus the struggle against plebeian leftist radicalism only signified a rebuttal of the attempt to urge the revolution beyond those bounds. Similar tendencies are apparent in Cromwell's struggles against the Levellers, albeit at a lower stage corresponding to the class relations of his times. In the Germany of both 1848 and 1918, on the other hand, the direct struggle which began against proletarian democratic left-wing radicalism tended to retain within the democratic forms thrown up by revolution as much as possible of the old order either intact or with minor external reforms. Thus no revolution in Germany brought about, for example, a real agrarian reform. Not one seriously affected the fragmentation into petty states. Not one really disturbed Junker rule in Prussia, and so on. Here, needless to say, it is impossible to relate the history of Germany in the 19th century in however abbreviated a form. We can but briefly outline the most essential elements in the development of social trends. Germany's plebeian sectors did not have the power during this period to fight for their interests by way of revolution. Thus the compulsory economic and social advances came about either under the pressure of foreign relations or as a compromise by the ruling classes. No internal class struggle was responsible even for the South German and Central German constitutions in the ducal states, the starting points for democratic movements and parties in Germany after Napoleon's overthrow. They were the product of a need to administer in some kind of uniform manner the heterogeneous feudal territories swept together in Napoleonic times and confirmed by the Congress of Vienna. Thus the population of Württemberg, for example, increased from 600,000 to 1/2 million during the Napoleonic age. No less than 78 provincial domains were tacked onto it. Such territories were heterogeneous in every respect. The administrative unifying of them Württemberg is a typical example of the period naturally called for a minimum number of centralized institutions which, in view of conditions in the Napoleonic period and the after-effects of the Wars of Liberation, were bound to involve a dissolution of the feudal absolutist, medieval leftovers. Under Napoleon's regime, the rulers of the petty German states were already striving to limit these concessions to a minimum after Napoleon's defeat. Even this was further reduced. The character of the central institutions meant that they had no deep roots in the nation and that the people could never regard them as its own personal creations, which was why they were so easy to abrogate both before and after 1848. And, when a serious revolution broke out in that year, it was possible for the effects of economic backwardness and national fragmentation that we have briefly depicted to leave the plebeian masses enfeebled and to lead the bourgeoisie to betray its own revolution, thus sealing the victory of feudal absolutist reaction. That defeat was crucial to the whole of Germany's later political and ideological development. In the terminology of the day, the proposition in respect of the central problem of democratic revolution read, unity through freedom, or unity before freedom? Or in respect of the concretely most important problem of revolution and Prussia's future position in Germany. Absorption of Prussia by Germany, or Prussianization of Germany? The quelling of the 1848 revolution meant that, in both cases, the second solution was the one adopted. To be sure, the triumphant reactionaries would have been delighted simply to return to the pre-1848 status quo. That, however, was impossible from an objective economic and social standpoint. The Prussian monarchy had to change, and had to do so, as Engels stressed time and again, on the lines of creating a Bonapartist monarchy. This apparently gave rise to a parallel between the development of France and Germany. It apparently meant that Germany's development was now catching up politically with France's. But this was only seemingly so. For in France, Bonapartism was a reactionary backlash beginning with the June defeat of the French proletariat, and its ignominious collapse led to the glorious Commune of 1871. And with the Third Republic, France reverted to the normal road of bourgeois democratic development. Bismarck's Germany was, as Engels accurately demonstrated, a copy of Bonapartist France in many respects. But Engels pointed out very firmly at the same time that Bonapartist monarchy, in Prussia and Germany, marked an advance compared to conditions before 1848, an objective advance in that the bourgeoisie's economic demands were met within this regime's framework and a freer avenue was opened up for the evolution of the forces of production. But these economic advances were realized without a triumphant bourgeois revolution. The national unity that had arisen consisted of a Prussianization of Germany which carefully preserved both the aristocratic bureaucracy and all the machinery to keep its political hegemony intact, three-class suffrage in Prussia, etc. Given Parliament's total lack of power, universal suffrage for the empire was still just a quasi-constitutional, quasi-democratic facade. Hence Marx, in criticizing the Gotha program, could rightly describe a nationally united Germany as a military despotism embellished with parliamentary forms and with feudal additions thrown in, already influenced by the bourgeoisie, bureaucratically structured and under political surveillance. We have located one of the most important weak points of the 1848 revolution in the lack of democratic experience and tradition, in the want of a democratic training of the masses and their ideological spokesman through Major internal class struggles. It is understandable that events after 1848, the conditions of Bonapartist monarchy, the creation of Germany unity from the top, through Prussian bayonets, again failed to provide any conditions favorable to the origin of revolutionary democratic traditions or a revolutionary democratic training of the masses. As a result of its impotence, the German parliament was automatically condemned to sterility. And since every single bourgeois party had its basis in a compromise with Bonapartist monarchy, the extra-parliamentary struggles of the masses, as far as they could spring up in the first place, were similarly doomed to sterility. The few real Democrats left over from the pre-1848 period remained isolated, lacking in influence and unable to educate a succeeding generation of Democrats. The fate of Johann Jacobi, who as a convinced petty bourgeois Democrat accepted a social democratic mandate out of despair and protest without holding any socialist views at all, and who could subsequently make nothing of his mandate, is typical of the situation of the few strict bourgeois Democrats in Germany. An important ideological obstacle to the origin of democratic traditions in Germany was the ever-increasing, large-scale falsification of German history. Here again we cannot even outline the details. It was, to summarize very briefly, a matter of idealizing and Germanizing the retarded sides of the German development, that is, of a version of history which extolled precisely the retarded character of Germany's development as particularly glorious and in accord with Germany's essence. It criticized and repudiated all the principles and products of Western bourgeois democratic and revolutionary developments as un-German and contrary to the character of the German national spirit, and the seeds of progressive turns in Germany history: the peasants' war, Jacobinism in Mainz, specific democratic trends in the era of the wars of liberation, plebeian reactions to the July Revolution in the Revolution of 1848. Were either totally hushed up or so falsified as to strike the reader as terrible warnings. From now on, 1848 was called the Year of Madness. In German bourgeois terminology, the reactionary periods in Germany's history, by contrast, were made to look splendid and illustrious. This rewriting was not limited, however, to historical facts, their selection and treatment. It influenced in a significant way the methodology of the social and historical sciences. And indeed, far over and above them, the whole of social and historical thinking in Germany. Briefly summarizing, we may say that after the pre-1848 period's attempts to grasp the rational laws of society and history, here it will suffice to refer to Hegel, there arose a fresh wave of historico-social irrationalism. This was already strongly developed in the Romantic movement and its offshoots, but only became a dominant trend after the crushing of the 1848 revolution. Here we are less concerned with a methodological and scientific characterization of this trend, as we shall see. Although irrationalism in the imperialist age found numerous points of connection with it, that represented something essentially new then. With its roots in Germany's social and political life, the most important factor of all is the average German's underdog mentality, a mentality by no means affected by the 1848 revolution, and also that of the intellectual, however highly placed. We have noted that the major upheavals at the start of the modern era, which laid the foundations for democratic developments in the West, ended in Germany with the establishment, for centuries to come, of petty tyrants, and that the German Reformation founded an ideology of submission to them. Neither the struggles for liberation from the Napoleonic yoke nor the year 1848 could alter this intrinsically. And since the German nations Unity was created not by way of revolution but from the top, and, according to historical legend, through blood and iron. The mission of the Hohenzollerns and the genius of Bismarck, this side of the Germans, mentality and morals remained virtually unchanged. There sprang up large cities in place of often semi-medieval small towns. The big capitalist, with his agents, replaced the shopkeeper, artisan and small entrepreneur. World politics superseded parish pump politics, but during this process the German people's subservience to its authorities underwent only the slightest of changes. Hessling in Heinrich Mann's novel Man of Straw differs from the bourgeois hero of Gustav Freytag only in his aggressiveness towards inferiors, not in servility to those above him. So the characterization published by Hugo Broos in 1919 is valid for the German people, with the obvious period variations. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, the most easily governed nation in the world is the German, meaning a lively and active nation of average proficiency and intelligence with a developed critical bent for argument. A nation, however, which in public affairs is neither accustomed nor willing to act spontaneously without or against the will of authority. A nation which thus is excellently ordered and acts under official guidance almost as though it were only performing its own common will. This readiness to be organized, along with its efficiency, does indeed provide incomparably fine material for an organization, the purest form of which is of course the military type. Here we have the immediate, subjective source of pre-imperialist German irrationalism. Whereas the Western democracies, by and large, considered the state policies and so on to be largely their own work, expected rationality from them and saw their own rationality reflected therein, the German attitude again, by and large, was the complete opposite. The German historians' axiom "history is man-made" was only the historico-methodological reverse side of the Prusso-bureaucratic view of the subject's limited understanding of the proclamation of the Battle of Jena. A citizen's first duty is to keep the peace. In both instances it is authority alone which acts, and does so on the basis of an intuitive reading of inherently irrational facts. The ordinary mortal, mass man, the subject, is either the unquestioning tool or the object, or the open-mouthed observer of actions by those with a special vocation for them. Through its initial successes, up to the founding of the Reich, Bismarck's unscrupulous Realpolitik contributed greatly to the development of this irrationalism. The sterility and failures which followed the foundation of the Reich were painted as an irrational tragedy if not passed off as successes achieved by exploiting irrational constellations through a brilliant Realpolitik. Admirers of the period of overt and aggressive German imperialism under Wilhelm II explained it as reflecting the emperor's personality of genius, and its detractors with the statement that Bismarck left no successor of the same stature. These widespread tendencies in average German historical studies were reinforced by the journalism of circles who saw a threat to their interests in a parliamentarization of Germany and therefore propagated Hohenzollern personal rule. In reality, the uncurbed reign of a civil and military bureaucracy, as the German people's only road to salvation. Clearly the way in which the German Empire was founded substantially strengthened the opportunity for the extensive spread of such views. Closely connected with this development was the battle of German historical theorists and historians against the concept of a rationally comprehensible progress. As we know, this battle was a universal one which, as we shall note in detail later, springs up inexorably from the soil of a capitalism in decline, indeed a capitalism that has become internally problematic, an international phenomenon. Therefore, what was specific, to the German development was merely that this tendency emerged much earlier and much more firmly than in any other country. This peculiarity in Germany's intellectual development, viz., that it yielded leading thinkers with a radically reactionary attitude to reality, chiefly Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, but also Spengler, Heidegger and others, we shall examine in detail later with regard to its philosophical principles and consequences. For the moment, however, we are concerned with the primary, elementary, socio-historical basis. This is the curious unity, simultaneous and indivisible in reality, of Germany's seasonable and unseasonable evolutionary trend. For a long time Germany was simply a backward country both economically and socially, although in the intellectual sphere she was growing into the equal partner and indeed in some areas the spiritual leader of the bourgeois world. This situation engendered an ideology paving the way for democratic revolution in Germany. German writers and thinkers from Lessing to Heine, from Kant to Hegel and Feuerbach. Certainly there was already arising at that time in the Romantic movement and its offshoots an idealization of German backwardness which, in order to defend this position, was forced to interpret the course of events in a radically irrationalist way and to contest the idea of progress as an allegedly shallow, dim and misleading conception. Schopenhauer went farthest in this respect, and that accounts for both his total lack of influence before 1848 and his worldwide effect after the revolution was defeated with the founding of the Reich. Indeed, already during the time leading up to it, the objective foundations of these problems gained in complexity. Year by year Germany became less backward economically. On the contrary, in the imperialist age German capitalism outstripped English capitalism, hitherto preeminent in Europe. Germany became next to the United States, the most highly developed and most typical capitalist area of the world. But at the same time, as we have seen, there was a consolidating of her democratically retarded social and political structure. Agrarian conditions, quasi-parliamentarism, the emperor's personal rule, remnants of the territorial division into small duchies, and so on. Thereupon, the contradiction existing in the earlier phases was reproduced at a higher and also qualitatively new stage. Abstractly considered, two ways of surmounting this contradiction presented themselves. One was the call for Germany's social and political structure to align itself with her economic development. This demand could be put in a revolutionary style. It was possible to propose the task of at last carrying out the completion of democratic revolution in Germany. Friedrich Engels posed the issue thus to the German Social Democrats in his critique of the Erfurt program. Alternatively, and from the standpoint of a real and inwardly seasonable German imperialism, the target could be to align, without touching the social structure, the political superstructure with the established and in relation to Germany constantly enduring forms of Western parliamentary democracy. As we shall see, this was the fairly isolated position of Max Weber. It bore, mutatis mutandis, a certain similarity to the endeavors of Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, who strove to introduce the French Revolution's military achievements into a reformed Old Prussia. But the contradictory relationship thus presented between economics and politics in Germany did not impede the evolution of German capitalism. It is here that the Prussian road of capitalist development in Germany is fully tangible. Because of this, there arose as a matter of necessity an ideology constituting the intellectual defense of the contradiction between Germany's economic and political structure as a higher stage of development, with a better potential for development compared to the democratic West. Clearly, this defense had to look for philosophical support in irrationalism again. Here, of course, it was possible for all kinds of conceptions to originate, and historically and philosophically to analyze them all. Indeed, just to enumerate them would burst the bounds of these studies. Hence we shall only indicate some of the typical theories that arose. Capitalism may in a positive or negative spirit, with enthusiasm, disapproval or resignation be viewed as predestined. I need only refer to Treich's account of the origin of the customs union. Germany's highly developed capitalism thereby acquires the rating of an irrational destiny. And the vessel of the other principle, also irrational, but differently rated, the German state, acquires the task of bestowing meaning on the blind destiny of the economy on the basis of the ruler's purely personal, hence again irrational, disposition. Or we impute to the state, in its German form, a salutary irrational counterbalance to the sickly, life-destroying rationality represented by the capitalist economy, and so on and so forth. All such conceptions contain a polemic against the universal bourgeois idea of progress in the Western democracies. They imply a repudiation of the notion that the development of state and society out of feudal forms, their increasing adaptation to the demands of capitalism. We recall Herbert Spencer's sociology, signifies a step forward. On the contrary, the German development was rated the higher one precisely because, as a result of the conservation of older, non-rational, forms of governance, it could solve various problems, ethical, cultural, etc., for which the society and social thinking of the rationally oriented West could never find a solution. It goes without saying that here, the effective combating of socialism played a decisive role. Irrationalism and a hostility to progress therefore go together. In this very togetherness they formed an effective ideological defense of the social and political backwardness of a Germany rapidly developing in the capitalist sphere. And it is at once clear that the philosophical hypotheses we have outlined of the German reading of history exerted a crucial influence on that fabrication of historical legends which we mentioned earlier. The weakness of the democratic movement in Germany is also evident in its inability to oppose this ideological campaign of falsification on a grand scale with anything of its own. Any real history of Germany or history of the struggles for democratic revolutions, it was also unable to put up an effective challenge to the philosophical foundations of these historical legends. The epistemological agnosticist, ethico-socially postulative character of the neo-Kantianism now predominant was as incapable of doing so as the sociology occasionally imported from other Western countries. Thus the whole of German youth grew up lacking a democratic tradition. Franz Mehring was the only German historian to make a vigorous stand against this fabrication of legends, bringing great honor upon himself in the process. But his efforts too remained isolated, and this to a growing degree as a result of the dominance of German social democracy by the reformist movement. So democratic traditions became more and more rootless in Germany. The sporadic democratic campaigners who appeared later had mostly so little real contact with German history that they often took over uncritically and on trust the dichotomy which reaction had created, artificially, between the purportedly ancient German character of their fatherland's stunted development and democracy as imported from the West. They just applied the antithesis in reverse, that is, siding with the un-German West. Naturally, this further increased their ideological and political isolation in Germany. Here, only the labor movement could have provided a center of political and ideological resistance, as the Neue Rheinische Zeitung did in 1848 September and as Lenin and the Bolsheviks did on Russia's behalf. But the general trends of Germany's development were operative in the labor movement as well. Before Bismarck rounded off national unity, it was a matter of course that the central question of democratic revolution should become the essential cause of a split in the emergent labor movement. On the one hand, Lassalle and Schweitzer after him stood for the Prussian Bonapartist road. Here the unfavorable circumstances of the German development had a momentous effect. Lassalle, with whom the mass movement of the working class began after the 1848 revolution, was far more under the ideological influence of the reigning Bonapartist trend than histories of the German labor movement would have it. His personal and political move towards Bismarck in the last years of his life was by no means a chance aberration, as it is often depicted, but rather the inevitable logical consequence of his whole philosophical and political position. Lassalle took over from Hegel in a wholly uncritical fashion the reactionary idealist concept of the state's primacy over the economy, which he mechanically applied to the proletarian liberation movement. He was thereby rejecting those forms of the labor movement which, through an independent stand by the proletariat, might have led to a struggle for democratic elbow room and a democratic confrontation with the bureaucratic state of Bonapartist Prussia. Economically too, the workers were to expect their liberation to come from the Prussian state, from the state of Bismarck. In this context, the one-sided emphasis on universal suffrage as the central demand likewise acquired a Bonapartist accent, all the stronger in that the internal organization of the German General Workers' Union, with its combination of Lassalle's personal dictatorship and occasional referendum polls by the sovereign people, similarly exhibited a markedly Bonapartist character. It was possible for Lassalle to send the statutes of his empire, as he himself put it, to Bismarck with the comment that the latter might perhaps be envious of them. It is not surprising that on this basis, Lassalle now even proceeded to social kingship, and a direct underpinning of Bismarck's unifying policy. Meanwhile Wilhelm Liebknecht, who, under the influence of Marx and Engels, recognized and criticized the errors of Lassalle and his school, was also unable to sustain the proper line. Succumbing very often to the ideological influence of democratic petty bourgeois trends from southern Germany, he opposed the Bismarckian solution and Lassalle's defense of it not with the old revolutionary democratic line of the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, but with a petty bourgeois democratic federalism of South German, anti-Prussian character. In the course of the German labor movement's later development, the reinforced reformist movement was also operative in this question. Engels criticized with ruthless venom the opportunistic failings of the Erfurt Manifesto in this respect. Above all, he stressed what the program lacked: the call for a resolute struggle for the real democratization of Germany, for a revolutionary democratic completion of national unity, which in Bismarck's solution was reactionary and therefore remained incomplete. After Engels's death, reformism became stronger and fell increasingly in step with the compromising liberal bourgeoisie. The real battle for Germany's radical democratization, for the ideological and political underpinning of revolutionary democratic movements, found a diminishing echo in German social democracy. The isolation of Franz Mehring, the sole strict representative of such traditions, may be ascribed not least to this situation. And the reformist distortion of Marxism was not only confined to the overtly opportunistic right wing, which even went so far as to support colonial imperialism. It also embraced the so-called Marxist Center, which, while using universal revolutionary catchwords, made its peace with Germany's existing state of affairs very much in the spirit of Realpolitik. In this way the German labor movement was prevented from becoming a rallying point and cynosure for the democratic forces sporadically in evidence, and from training and leading these. And in opposing reformism's opportunist tendencies, large sections of the dissident left lapsed into a sectarian attitude to the problems of bourgeois democracy and in particular to the national question. That is a major reason why they and later on, in the war, the Spartacist League were unable to radiate any influence of the kind the Bolsheviks had in Russia. It was in such circumstances that Germany entered the imperialist epoch. As we know, it was accompanied by a major economic boom, an extraordinarily strong concentration of capital, etc. Germany became the leading imperialist state in Europe and also the most aggressive imperialist state, the one pressing most fiercely for the ready vision of the world. Again, the character of German imperialism was a consequence of the belated but very swift development of capitalism when Germany became a major capitalist power. The carving up of the colonial world was already nearly over, so that imperialist Germany could only create a colonial empire to match her economic weight on the basis of aggression and the takeover of existing colonies. Hence there arose in Germany an especially voracious imperialism, greedy for spoils, aggressive, vehemently and ruthlessly pressing for the reapportioning of the colonies and vested interests. This economic situation contrasted very remarkably with the German people's great democratic political immaturity in this period, but its immaturity was not only an extremely important political factor and meant not only that the cavalier and adventurous foreign policy of Wilhelm II could carry the day without major internal friction. It also had ideological consequences of importance to the problem we are studying. No state of affairs is ever stable, it must always go on moving either forwards or backwards. And since no progressive democratic further development of the German people ensued in the imperialist age, for the reasons we have shown, a further retrogression was bound to set in. This was connected with a general politico-ideological trend existing during the imperialist period on an international scale. On the one hand, there reigned a far-reaching general anti-democratic tendency. On the other, where there existed a bourgeois democracy, imperialist conditions inevitably gave rise to a certain disappointment with democracy on the part of the masses and their ideological spokesmen because of its de facto meager power over the bourgeoisie's private executive, and because of certain anti-democratic phenomena necessarily associated with it under capitalism, the election machinery, etc. Hence it was far from being an accident that precisely in democratic countries there set in a widespread criticism of democracy extending from overtly reactionary movements to within the labor movement, syndicalism in the Mediterranean countries. The general drift of this criticism was unquestionably romantic reactionary. Hence we must bear in mind that it often contained a justified disappointment with bourgeois democracy, a disillusioned and sometimes relatively forward-looking experience of its social limitations. Let us recall Anatole France's mockery of democratic equality before the law, magisterially prohibiting rich and poor alike from sleeping under the arches. And let it be noted, when Anatole France wrote that, he was still far removed from socialism, which makes his statement typical of the critical attitude towards democracy of progressive intellectual circles in the West. A characteristic mixture of accurate criticism and muddled reactionary tendencies may also be observed in Bernard Shaw. The most complicated and, for a time, most influential assortment of such trends appeared in George Sorel, ideologist of syndicalism, particularly in their reactionary nuances. These tendencies had an important and far-reaching effect on the German intelligentsia of the imperialist age. When, however, they were taken up in Germany, they underwent a profound social change. For whereas in the other Western countries they expressed a disappointment with the bourgeois democracy already attained, in Germany they became an obstacle to its attainment, a renunciation of persistent struggle on its behalf. These tendencies were mingled, in Germany, with the old official propaganda of the Bismarck period, which located in Germany's backwardness the expression of Germany's essence, the specifically German quality which it propagated in history, sociology, and so forth. During the Bismarck period the democratic and indeed, in part, liberal intelligentsia rebodied such a view of society and history, Virchow, Mommsen, etc., but they were weak internally and lacked influence externally. Criticism of democracy was now accepted in Germany as an advanced Western intellectual trend. With the aid of different historical and ideological rationales, a capitulation ultimately came about to those ideologists who were enervating the struggle for democracy and sapping it of its ideological and political vigor. Let us take, to cite one characteristic example, the most important bourgeois sociologist and historian of the Wilhelmine age, Max Weber. For patriotic reasons Weber was against the Wilhelmine system, clearly perceiving its dilettantism and its inability to compete diplomatically with French or English democracy. Accordingly, he became an increasingly firm supporter of the democratizing of Germany, but since his thinking was deeply pervaded by the disillusioned Western criticism of democracy, Weber only regarded this as the lesser evil. Compared with the existing system we can observe similar contradictions in other politicians and thinkers of the time, varying, to be sure, from individual to individual, as in Friedrich Naumann. Clearly it was impossible for a radical bourgeois democratic movement or even party to originate on such an ideological basis. With Naumann this switch from left-wing criticism to right-wing principles and praxis is especially striking. There thus appeared among the leading German intellectuals of the Wilhelmine period a repetition of the German Misere, on a higher scale, ultimately, in the majority of cases, a Philistinism without real public concerns. The Western critique of democracy led most of them to see something special in Germany's undemocratic development, a higher stage compared to the problematic undemocratic democracy of the West. There thus arose a climate of narrow pen-pushing capitulation to Germany's existing political system, very often a snobbish, aristocratic attitude which, while criticizing bourgeois life and culture in a sometimes acute, often even witty and telling way, kowtowed to the Wilhelmine system's titled bureaucrats and officers and idealized their undemocratic machinery with its semi-feudal leftovers. These tendencies are particularly apparent in Sternheim, the witty satirist, and the democratic politician Rathenau. Naturally such a right-wing critique of Western bourgeois democracy too contained certain elements of truth. Above all, many facts cited against the essentially undemocratic character of the Western democracies were true in themselves. Precisely regarding this question, however, an accurate critique could only come from the left. It will suffice to look at Anatole France. Already in his early output we find sharply satirical observations and comments on the democracy of the Third Republic. but only when he started to develop in a socialist direction as a result of the lessons of the Dreyfus case does this critique become an organic, dynamic part of his shaping of society and history. Mutatis mutandis, a similar tendency may be traced in Thomas Mann in his reflections of a non-political. The German brand of romantic anti-capitalism still obscures and distorts the rightful elements of his critique of bourgeois democracy. But when, in the period of the Weimar Republic, Thomas Mann was really converted to the democratic line, his skepticism with regard to Western bourgeois democracy also began to bear fruit in his writing. An example is the portrait of Settembrini in The Magic Mountain, where Mann unites ironic criticism of the typical narrowness of bourgeois democracy, its total inability to resolve the basic social questions of modern society, with a constant emphasis on Settembrini's relative progressiveness compared with NAPHTA's mystificatory proto-fascism and Hans Castorp's apolitical lethargy, the idealizing of bureaucracy's competence, expertise, impartiality, etc. In contrast to the dilettantism of party politicians and parliament was another general trend in the anti-democratic movements of Western Europe. Faget is just one example. It expresses very clearly the reactionary character of the movement as a whole. Sometimes consciously, but mostly unconsciously, the writers who proclaimed such ideas were the hacks of imperialist monetary capital, which sought and very often achieved the continuous assertion of its specific interests through its subcommittees, through stooges rendered independent of elections or ministerial changes. Consider the internal power structure in the foreign ministries, the oft-changing parliamentary leaders and unchanging secretaries of state, principal spokesmen, etc., in the bourgeois democratic countries of Western Europe. Because this tendency cropped up in a Germany that was not yet democratic, it reinforced ideologically the successful resistance of the imperial and Prussian civil and military bureaucracy to any attempt at a progressive restructuring of state institutions. Quasi-parliamentarianism degenerated into total impotence. But its obligatory, patent sterility did not motivate an extension of democracy. It led, on the contrary, to its further paralysis and stasis and to a greater powerlessness. Needless to say, German imperialist monetary capital was as much capable of exploiting this situation as that of Western Europe was of exploiting the parliamentary system. For the German development, however, this constellation signified the growth of remnants of the German Masseur into a particularly reactionary imperialism unaffected by any kind of democratic controls. This trend had a particularly devastating effect in Germany because it not only helped to preserve the old servility of the average, and even the spiritually and morally highly developed intellectual, but also gave it a new ideological sanction. The absolutist leftovers, which Bismarckian Bonapartism conserved and modernized simultaneously, found a special buttress in the politico-moral intellectual culture of bureaucracy. The bureaucrat considered it his particular pride and honor to carry out the orders of higher authority in a technically perfect way, even if he disagreed with their substance. And this spirit, which was confined to the bureaucrat class in the narrowest sense in lands with old democratic traditions, spread far beyond the bureaucracy in Germany. To submit unreservedly to the decisions of authority was regarded as a special German virtue in contrast to freer democratic thinking elsewhere, and extolled more and more loudly as the hallmark of a socially higher stage of development. Even Bismarck, who personally and in his institutions greatly promoted this transference of politico-social abasement from the petty states to the united, powerful nation, this perpetuating of the nullity of Public opinion occasionally criticized the Germans' lack of civil courage, individual sense of public duty. For the reasons we have indicated, this tendency degenerated during the Wilhelmine period into nothing short of a Byzantinism of the intelligentsia, a very widespread middle-class servility that was boastful outwardly and cringing inwardly. This was, we repeat, a sometimes involuntary intellectual sell-out to the history-fudging propaganda of the glory of German backwardness. Although it had already started in the age of Bismarck, it now embraced even the most advanced and highly developed sections of leading bourgeois intellectuals in a more refined higher form that was sometimes subjectively oppositional, objectively always quasi-oppositional, and hence of all the more service to imperialism. Here the social affinity and also the spiritual parallel between higher and ordinary reactionary ideology is quite palpable, just as Schopenhauer's Buddhist quietism, say, matched petty bourgeois apathy after the 1848 revolution, and the transformation requested by Nietzsche of the relationship between capitalists and workers into one between officers and soldiers corresponds to specific capitalist militaristic wishes in the imperialist age, so the same applies here. In establishing these parallels, we are on no account disputing the difference in intellectual level. That, on the contrary, will continue to be a prominent consideration. Not, however, chiefly because of the intellectual standard, but because it enlarged the social scope of the reactionary currents, and because these currents engulfed sectors which they did not reach with normal intellectual methods and which had precious little time for their usual demands. Only in their ultimate social consequences, and these were crucial to Germany's fate, intellectually as otherwise did they lead into the same reactionary stream. When, for instance, Plenge opposed the ideas of 1914 as the higher and German ones, to the 1789 ideas at the start of the First World War, it meant that a large portion of the best German intellectuals had already sunk to the level of Treich's propagandistic history. This unscrupulousness and loss of intellectual and moral standards can be observed in a particularly crude form in the pamphlets appearing at the outbreak of war. Take, to select one very characteristic example, Werner Sombart's contrasting of heroes, the Germans, and dealers, English democracy. The collapse of the Wilhelmine system in the First World War and the setting up of the Weimar Republic also brought no radical change for the better with regard to Germany's democratization and the origin of deep-seated democratic traditions among the broad masses, beyond the class-conscious proletariat. In the first place, this political democratization stemmed less from the inner power of popular forces than from a military collapse. Large circles of the German bourgeoisie accepted the republic and democracy partly because the situation compelled them to, partly because they expected to gain advantages in foreign affairs, more favorable peace terms with President Wilson's help, etc. This was a major difference from the Democratic Republic in the Russia of 1917. There, large petty bourgeois and peasant masses were firmly democratic from the outset, although a very similar climate to Germany's could be noted among the upper middle class, and the leading members of petty bourgeois and peasant democracy were betrayers of democracy. The schisms among the social revolutionaries, for instance, clearly reflect the democratic mood among the petty bourgeois and peasant masses. Secondly, Germany's retarded development had repercussions here as well. Right at the outset of the bourgeois democratic revolution in 1918, the proletariat was waiting as the decisive social power, but owing to the strength of reformism and the current ideological and organizational weakness of the labor movement's left flank, it was unequal to the problems of Germany's regeneration. Therefore bourgeois democracy was, as Engels had prophesied long before, essentially a union of all bourgeois forces against the impending danger of a proletarian revolution. Here the experience is just undergone of the Russian Revolution of 1917 had an enormous effect not only on the bourgeoisie itself but also on the reformist wing of the labor movement. Accordingly, this wing in fact supported unreservedly the democratic coalition of all bourgeois forces against the proletariat. Indeed, it formed its real center, its dynamo. Hence the Weimar Republic was essentially a republic without republicans, a democracy without democrats, just as the French Republic was in historically totally different circumstances. Of course, between 1848 and 1851 the leftist bourgeois parties allied with the reformists did not serve the cause of revolutionary democracy while parading the Republican and Democratic banners. They were in essence parties standing for order, which meant in practice that as few changes as possible were made to the Wilhelmian social structure, preservation of the Junker officer corps, the old bureaucracy and most of the petty states, no agrarian reform, etc. In these circumstances it is not surprising that there very soon arose a deep disappointment with democracy among the popular masses who, as we have seen, had never received a democratic training and fostered no live democratic traditions, and that they turned away from democracy relatively quickly. This process gained in speed and depth for the particular reason that the Weimar democracy was forced to implement and engender the greatest national humiliation experienced by Germany since the time of Napoleon, the imperialist Peace of Versailles. To the democratically uneducated popular masses, therefore, the Weimar Republic signified the executive organ of this national humiliation in contrast to the times of national greatness and expansion, associated with Friedrich II of Prussia, Blücher and Moltke, that is, with monarchist, undemocratic memories. Here again we can observe the big contrast between the German and the Franco-English development, where revolutionary democratic periods, Cromwell, the Great Revolution, etc. were the periods of greatest national upsurge. The circumstances of the Weimar Republic's origin supported the old view of an anti-democratic development that was specifically German, and uniquely suited to Germany's essence. They supplied a seemingly obvious pretext for the tale that German national greatness could come about only on anti-democratic foundations. Reactionary philosophy, history and journalism richly exploited this situation, and the left wing of the bourgeoisie and bourgeois intelligentsia could find no effective countermeasures. So among broad sections of the bourgeoisie and petty bourgeoisie, the old prejudice gained ground in the course of the Weimar Republic that democracy in Germany was a Western import, a harmful foreign body which the nation had to expel for its own good. An indication of the lack of tradition in many subjectively convinced Democrats is that for their part, they made the allegedly exclusively Western character of democracy the basis for their propaganda. By tactlessly and untactically placing in the forefront their anti-German sentiments, their enthusiasm for Western democracy, they were involuntarily helping the reactionaries in their anti-democratic yarn spinning. This ideology is seen at its clearest in the ambit of the Weltbahn. A further point was the nihilistic attitude of large sections of the radical bourgeois intelligentsia to the national humiliation, abstract pacifism, a nihilism which also found its way into the labor movement, although in different forms. This tendency was particularly marked in the German independent socialist camp, but under the influence of Rosa Luxemburg's ideological errors even the German Communist Party was not untouched by national nihilism at the start of its development. Nevertheless, the overt attempts to restore the Hohenzollern monarchy came to nothing. The party propounding this restoration, the German National, was never able to grow into a really major and decisive mass party, although its representatives retained most of their positions of power in the civil and military machinery because of the Weimar Republic's anti-proletarian, anti-revolutionary tendencies. Only when the disappointment of enormous masses reached a climax, as a result of the major crisis which set in from 1929, did the reactionaries succeed in gaining a foothold among the masses, in the National Socialist German Workers' Party and Hitlerian fascism. Our concern in these introductory studies is, therefore, briefly to outline the socio-ideological features which made possible in Germany this disgracefully swift and even more disgracefully long-term triumph of fascism, while briefly showing how it derived from Germany's previous development. We shall indicate at the same time the substance of its specifically new attributes, and also the reason why this new element should only signify a qualitative heightening of tendencies already present before we have seen that the Weimar Republic, owing to the manner of its origin, its social methods of defense against the left, its establishment and consolidation, was, on the one hand, a republic without republicans, a democracy without democrats. The initial enthusiasm of the masses quickly evaporated. It did so with the crumbling of hopes of Wilsonian peace for a German democracy and the dashing of the expectations linked with socialization. In the revolutionary-minded, leftist section of the labor movement especially, a hostile attitude to the Weimar system took root, a system which became fully established with the murder of the greatest heroes of Germany's new revolutionary labor movement, Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg. On the other hand, the supporters of the Hohenzollern restoration, entrenched reaction at the beginning of the era were, as we have also seen, far too weak to effect a permanent overthrow. It is also significant that their followers never grew into a real mass movement. It was now apparent that the Hohenzollern regime never possessed a real footing in the masses, and that was far from accidental. As long as Hohenzollern rule was, or at least seemed to be, undisturbed, the overtly and strictly authoritative character of the old form of reaction was able to keep the majority of the population in a mood of loyal enthusiasm. But after the collapse, when there appeared a new and less popular authority and the restoration could only be implemented by means of an armed rising, or, in the preliminary period, by way of a resolute political opposition, the quantitative and qualitative weakness of the mass basis of the old reaction came to light. So, as a result of the weakness of its adversaries on the left and right, the Weimar Republic acquired the chance of survival, inwardly very shaky and obtained through continual concessions to reaction. As long as Germany was in no position openly to renounce the Peace of Versailles, this was also underpinned by the pressure of foreign affairs and the German imperialists. Corresponding deliberations on foreign policy. For a proper overthrow to occur, new conditions had to come into being. Prominent among such conditions was the shift of class power within the reactionary camp. After the war, the monopoly capitalists became the leading group. This was also the conclusion to a long development, but a conclusion bringing something qualitatively new in 1848. The Rhine industrial magnates who represented German capitalism at its most advanced at that time already played a major role in quelling the revolution and re-establishing an anti-democratic regime in Germany, although the majority of them were liberal. Hence, in opposition to the regime, with their endeavors for an agreement they provided the anti-democratic monarchist forces with a breathing space at the time of the mounting revolutionary wave. With their formal parliamentary and always loyal opposition, they contributed to the disorganization of the democratic movement to stave off Hohenzollern reaction, then arming itself for reprisals, and so on. Under Bismarck, as also under Wilhelm II, the upper middle classes had an increasing influence on government policy that corresponded to the rapid development of German capitalism. But this influence was largely exerted via the backstairs. Apart from rare exceptions, Nuremberg, official political command remained in the old hands, preserving its old authoritative technique. Indeed, Wilhelm II's style of government resembled an imperialist recreation of the style of Friedrich Wilhelm IV. After the World War II, the now decidedly dominant influence of monopoly capital often operated behind the scenes, preferring the election of executive organs and figureheads legitimized in other ways. Hindenburg, Brüning, Schleicher, etc. The alliance with the Prussian Junker class, with the Junker patriciate of the military and civil bureaucracy, remained in force, but monopoly capital now assumed the leading role on all matters in this alliance. It was no longer content to assert its aims in economic complexes that were vital to its vested interests. This development took place, however, in a social milieu in which the anti-capitalist sentiments of the masses were constantly increasing. The vanguard of the German working class keenly followed the Russian events of 1917 and subsequently perceived in them the perspective of German history they needed as well. The hopes pinned on the 1918 promises of socialization, the disappointment stemming from the whole movement's breakdown in the ensuing years, the gradual alienation of broad masses of workers from a Weimar Republic more and more patently under the thumb of monopoly capitalism, the provocative effects of the mass unemployment linked with the crisis after 1929, etc. All this gave birth to anti-capitalist feelings stretching far beyond the working class in scope. The reactionaries of monopoly capitalism were thus presented with a new task, the task of exploiting just these mass feelings to establish their own command, and using them for support, to found a new type of reactionary regime securing once and for all the absolute predominance of monopoly capitalism in all spheres of political and social life. Here we cannot make it our business to portray this political development of Germany even in outline. We only needed to indicate these political and social factors so that the tendencies portrayed and analyzed in our later philosophical studies may stand in proper relief to their social foundations. Let us just take the tasks stated above, namely the conversion of anti-capitalist mass drifts, indeed mass movements, into the naked absolute dominance of monopoly capitalism, which set itself the closely related task of converting widespread mass indignation, understandable and rightful in itself, at the imperialist Peace of Versailles, into an aggressive, imperialist chauvinism. It will be clear that only a radically irrationalist worldview is suited to even a purely demagogic reconciliation of such mutually conflicting tendencies. It will also be apparent at once that the required irrationalism, which was a long time in preparation and found a consummation in the National Socialist worldview, must differ qualitatively from the irrationalism of before and after 1848. Of course, given the German bourgeoisie's special receptiveness to irrationalism in the interwar period, its education by way of the old irrational philosophies plays no mean role. But if we wish to understand from the social angle the forcible propagation on a mass scale of the new, fascist slant, we must look at a couple of new socio-ideological phenomena here. The first thing we meet is a transformation in the working class. It is striking that this anti-rational tendency should take hold of broad masses, including considerable parts of the working class, and that the workers should now readily accept arguments which previously rebounded harmlessly off them. For where the masses are concerned, the question of reason or irrationality has more of the impact of a vital question, rather than a mere theoretical problem, than it does for the intelligentsia. The labor movement's great advances, the clear perspective of successful struggles to improve the situation and of a foreseeable overthrow of capitalism led the working class to see something rational and ordered in their own lives, their own historical development. Each successful battle, each rebuttal of the reactionaries, for example, at the time of the anti-socialist laws, reinforced this outlook and inculcated a sovereign contempt for the then crude religio, a rationalist propaganda put out by the reactionary camp with the victory of reformism and the reformists' participation in the Weimar system. This situation changed drastically. The idea of rationality in itself acquired a fundamentally different accent. Bernstein had already tried to disparage as utopian the revolutionary struggle for a socialist society and a final goal, proposing instead the humdrum and philistine realpolitik reasonableness of compromise with the liberal bourgeoisie and adjustment to capitalist society. Ever since the Social Democrats had become the ruling party, this realpolitik reasonableness had held sway over its members, in its propaganda and above all its deeds. In the first years of revolution, this propaganda was mingled with demagogic promises of imminent socialization, a socialism to be realized in this rational manner as opposed to the unreasonable adventures, the unrealistic policy of disaster, pursued by the communists. Relative stabilization, in Germany, meant the total command of Bernstein's rationality in reformist theory and practice. And in the era of the big economic world crisis, the reformists at the helm maintained this line of realpolitik reasonableness, with iron vigor. Thus reason signified in practice for the masses, not to go on strike because of a wage reduction but to submit to it. To refrain from any demonstrations, any energetic steps if unemployment benefits were reduced or if larger and larger masses were disqualified from receiving them. To steer clear of the most bloody fascist provocation, to withdraw to safety, not to defend the working class and its right-of-way but, as Dimitrov accurately characterized this policy, to avoid danger and not to tempt the beast from its lair. So reformist reason not only rendered the working class practically helpless in the struggles against imperialist capitalism and a fascism which was arming itself for a takeover of power. It also compromised and broke down the old conviction of a rationality in historical developments leading, through properly conducted struggles, to an improvement in the everyday situation of the working class and ultimately to its complete liberation. The reformists' propaganda against the Soviet Union reinforced this development by portraying the heroism of the Russian working class as futile, inappropriate and fruitless. This development entailed various consequences among the working class itself. A relatively large vanguard turned away from reformism to extend the old Marxian traditions in the new form appropriate to the imperialist age, that of Leninism. A broad sector remained transfixed on the level of realpolitik reasonableness, and became incapable in practice of providing an effective challenge to fascism. Hence for a relatively substantial mass of people, especially Among the young workers whom the desperate crisis had made impatient, this development shattered their faith in reason in general, in the revolutionary rationality of historical developments and the interconnection and compatibility of reason and revolution. So this sector, precisely as a result of its theoretical and practical training through reformism when the crisis loomed, was ready to assimilate in its outlook the modern tendencies of anti-rationality and the contempt for reason and science, and to indulge in the superstition of myth. That does not mean, of course, that these embittered young workers became readers and admirers of Nietzsche or Spengler. But since the antithesis of reason and emotion seemed to the masses to have sprung from life itself, they were bound to conceive a receptiveness to this doctrine on the ideological plane as well. Among the intelligentsia and petty bourgeoisie we find another kind of change, but one that became just as important in its consequences regarding a receptiveness to fascist irrationalism. Here we are dealing with despair as a mass emotion, and, closely connected with it, gullibility and the expectation of saving miracles. Without question, the universal spreading of an ideology of despair in Germany was primarily a sequel to the war, the Peace of Versailles, and the loss of a national and political perspective, which these groups associated consciously or not with a German imperialist victory. Spengler's huge success, which extended far beyond philosophical circles, is a clear reflection of this mood. Disappointments felt during the Weimar period, both among the right-wingers, who hoped to restore the monarchy, and among the more left-oriented, who were hoping for a democratic and indeed socialist regeneration of Germany, were bound to reinforce these sentiments still more, and they subsequently reached a climax in the great economic crisis of 1929. The objective foundations of these moods were therefore of an economic, political and social character. If, however, we examine their vehement, virtually unresisted propagation, we cannot possibly mistake the important role of the ideological development up to the First World War. And this in both a positive and negative respect. Negatively, the social ideology of helplessness and dependence we find in Germans brought up in the atmosphere of the authoritarian state, played an exceptionally important role. The average German, however proficient and even outstanding in his own field, including also philosophy, art, and so on, expected all decisions, even those determining his livelihood, to come from upstairs, from vocational leaders, in the army, politics, and economics, and it was completely beyond him to regard his own standpoints as co-determining factors in political and economic life, etc. Thus after the collapse of the Hohenzollern regime he remained helplessly disoriented. He always expected an improvement in his fortune to stem partly from the old and tried leaders, partly from a newly created leaders' outfit, and when it gradually became evident that they had all failed him, he was left in a state of total despair. However, this despair was linked with expectations of a new leader. Generally speaking, it produced no intention of an independent appraisal of the situation and of independent action. And on the positive side, the sentiments which made the fascist deception of the masses possible were nurtured by the influence of the agnosticist, pessimistic philosophical trends of which we shall give a detailed analysis later. Their common feature is that pessimism or despair was the standard moral attitude to the problems of the time, only, of course, for the intellectual elite. The plebs might believe in progress, but its optimism was inferior or infamous, as Schopenhauer already termed it in this connection. German philosophy in the imperialist age proceeded, as we shall see, from Nietzsche to Spengler and later in the Weimar period from Spengler to fascism. If we stress this spade work by German philosophy from Schopenhauer and Nietzsche onwards, it might be objected that we are dealing with esoteric doctrines circulated only within quite small groups. We believe, on the contrary, that one must not underestimate the indirect, subterranean effect on the masses of the fashionable reactionary ideologies analyzed so far. This effect was not limited to the direct influence of those philosophers' actual books, although it should be remembered that editions of the works of Schopenhauer and Nietzsche certainly reached many tens of thousands, but via universities, public lectures, the press, etc. These ideologies also spread to the broadest masses, needless to say in a coarsened form, but that strengthened rather than weakened their reactionary content, their ultimate irrationalism and pessimism, since the central ideas now received greater attention at the expense of qualifying statements. Through such ideologies the masses can be intensively corrupted without ever glimpsing the immediate source of corruption. Huxley's barbarizing oaky instincts, his vitalism, his heroic pessimism, etc., are necessary products of the imperialist age, and Nietzsche's speeding up OE process operated on tens of thousands of people who had never even heard of Nietzsche. These factors, however, merely reinforced the readiness for a philosophy of despair. What was new about it in relation to similar past tendencies stemmed from Germany's situation between the two world wars. The most important difference between the pre-war and post-war period was undoubtedly the severe shock to, and later the almost complete loss of security in the social and individual life of the middle classes, above all the intelligentsia. If a person was a pessimist before the First World War, and primarily with regard to culture, this attitude had a placidly contemplative character without any intention of possible action. Since an individual's own existence seemed secure in material and social, spiritual and human terms, it was possible for his philosophy to remain as good as purely theoretical, without seriously influencing his conduct and inner attitude. The cessation of security, the continual threatening of both the inner and outward life, caused this irrationalist pessimism to take a practical turn. This is not to say that a person's view of the world was now bound to produce actions in an immediate sense, but merely that on the one hand it started out from a personally sensed threat to his existence, and not only from the contemplation of an objective cultural situation, and that, on the other hand, practical claims were made with regard to his philosophy, albeit in the form that the impossibility of action was deduced ontologically from the structure of the world. At all events, the old forms of irrationalism proved to be unsuitable for answering these questions. And now we can see the need to which we shall hark back repeatedly for fascist demagogy, much though it took over from the old type of reactionary ideology in both form and content, to be oriented in method towards the more recent ideologies created under imperialism, stripping them of everything private and spiritually high-flying, and converting what was left into a determined and uncouth form of popular corruption. Everything that had been said on irrational pessimism from Nietzsche and Dilthey to Heidegger and Jaspers on lecture platforms and in intellectuals, salons and cafes, Hitler and Rosenberg transferred to the streets. We shall see how much was preserved of the particular methodology of this development, in the basic contents, either in spite or because of demagogic coarsening through National Socialist philosophy. Its starting point, as regards the psychology of the masses, was precisely this mass despair, the resulting credulity and belief in miracles. And here the masses included the most highly qualified intellectuals. That despair was the socio-psychological connecting link between National Socialism and the broad masses is evident from the fact that the movement's real impetus, its real penetration of the masses began with the economic crisis of 1929. It began the moment that an initially general philosophical despair, which gradually assumed increasingly concrete social forms, turned into a massive threat to individual existence the moment, therefore, that the aforestated intentions in a practical direction yielded the possibility of rendering philosophical despair subservient to the politics of desperados. These politics now drew on the old servile instincts of the authority-minded Germans, instincts which the Weimar democracy had hardly affected. But the method of subjection had to be a new one because, for the first time in German history, it was not now a matter of submission to a traditional, legitimate power, nor of the mere restoration of such a power, but of joining a radical coup, a revolution as National Socialism liked to style itself. In its early days as well as in later crises. This non-legitimate, revolutionary character of fascist power is one of the reasons why, with regard to methodology, National Socialism needed to associate itself with philosophical models of Nietzsche's kind more than with reactionary ideology of the old school. To be sure, fascist demagogy was extremely versatile. Simultaneously with the assertion of its revolutionary character, it tried to appeal also to potential instincts of legitimacy, for example, Hindenburg's role in the transitional period, the formally legitimate seizure of power, etc. But despair alone would not have sufficed as a socio-psychological connecting link. Precisely. In respect of its practical intention, it needed implicitly to contain the elements of gullibility and superstitiousness we had already mentioned. These elements were indeed present, and not by accident. For the greater the personal despair, the more this expresses the sense of a threat to individual existence, the more it will give rise on average, under the social and the spiritual, moral conditions of the German development to gullibility and superstition after Schopenhauer, and especially after Nietzsche. A rationalist pessimism broke down the conviction that there existed an objective external world and that an unrestricted and thorough perception of it would indicate a way out of the problems arousing despair. Knowledge of the world was now increasingly converted into a more and more arbitrary interpretation of the world. Naturally, this philosophical tendency heightened this sector's habit of expecting everything to come from the authorities, for to their mind life too was not a question of the objective analysis of concrete connections, but of interpreting decisions whose reasons could never be known. And it is also immediately clear that here lay one of the socio-psychological sources of the faith in miracles. However desperate the situation, the genius favored by God, Bismarck, Wilhelm II, Hitler, would find an answer all right. Through his creative intuition, it is further plain to see that, the greater the risk to security and the more directly individual existence was itself at stake, the more intensive this credulity and faith in miracles would become. Thus we are dealing with an old, traditional failing of the German middle class, embracing Nietzschean philosophy and the mentality of the average beer hall philosopher. We will often be asked in amazement how it was that large masses of the German people could trustingly accept the puerile myth propounded by Hitler and Rosenberg. We may counter with the historical question, how could the best educated and intellectually most eminent man in Germany believe in Schopenhauer's Mythical Will, The Pronouncements of Nietzsche's Zarathustra, or the History Myths of the Decline of the West. And it is not good enough to say that the intellectual and artistic level of Schopenhauer and Nietzsche is immeasurably higher than the coarse and contradictory demagogy of Hitler and Rosenberg. For if a person educated in philosophy and literature is able to follow epistemologically the nuances of Nietzsche's reworking of Schopenhauer, and to appreciate with aesthetic and psychological sensitivity the nuances of his critique of decadence, yet still believes in the Zarathustra myth, the myth of the Superman and eternal recurrence, this is at bottom harder to fathom than the despairing belief of a poorly educated working youth, someone who was never or only temporarily a member of a party and was left out in the cold after finishing his apprenticeship, that Hitler would realize German socialism. The same applies here as what Marx once said about the cynical doctrines of classical economics, that the doctrines did not come out of books into reality, but entered books from reality. The question of whether, at a given time, there reigns a climate of sound and sober criticism or a climate of superstition, faith in miracles and irrationalist credulity in specific sections of society, is not a matter of intellectual standards but of the condition of society. Obviously, ideologies which have previously exerted an influence will play a considerable part by reinforcing or weakening the tendency towards criticism or credulity. But do not let us forget that the efficacy or inefficacy of an intellectual tendency likewise enters books from reality, and not vice versa. History tells us that eras of particularly acute credulity, superstition and of faith in miracles must by no means always be eras of notably inferior civilization. The very opposite is true. We see such a tendency at the close of antiquity in the climax of Greco-Roman civilization, at the time when Alexandrian learning was at its most prevalent. And we find that during this period, it was by no means merely uneducated slaves or small craftsmen, the transmitters of Christianity, who were most prone to believe in miracles. Credulity and superstition are just as much to be found in the highly gifted and well-educated scholars and artists of the era, in Plutarch or Apuleius, Plotinus or Porphyrios. To be sure, with a quite different substance, on a higher literary plane, more subtle intellectually, more educated. And the climax of the witchcraft craze, to cite one more characteristic example, was never the darkest hour of the Middle Ages, but the great critical transitional period between the medieval and modern epochs, the age of Galileo and Kepler. Once again we find that many of the most important minds of the epoch were not free from various forms of superstition. We have only to think of Francis Bacon, Jacob Boehme, Paracelsus, etc. The factor common to such ages of social folly, of superstition and of faith in miracles taken to extremes, is that they were always periods of the decline of an old social order and a culture implanted for centuries, and at the same time epochs of fresh birth pangs. In the German crisis years, this general uncertainty of capitalist life saw a heightening which marked a change over into a qualitatively new and special state of affairs, and the changeover caused this susceptibility to folly to spread on an unprecedented mass scale. This susceptibility fascism exploited in the most ruthless manner possible. Later we shall describe and analyze the theoretical forms concretely assumed by this demagogic exploitation of the desperate situation in which the broadest sections of the German people found themselves. Only then in our concrete analysis, can we really drive it home how fascist demagogy and tyranny was only the ultimate culmination of a long process which initially had an innocent, Look, innocent in a strictly or more generally philosophical sense, the destruction of reason. The beginnings of this process may be found in the feudal counter-reformist, reactionary romantic struggle against the French Revolution, and as we have noted it reached its peak in the imperialist age of capitalism. This process was by no means merely restricted to Germany. Its origins, its Hitlerian manifestation, and its survival in the present age, all have international roots from the socio-economic standpoint, and a rationalist philosophy is therefore likewise in evidence internationally. However, we have seen in our introduction that it could attain the same fiendish influence nowhere but in Hitler's Germany, that apart from very rare exceptions it nowhere reached the same hegemony it had already reached in Germany, and not only on the national but also on an international scale. Hence it has been necessary briefly to record and to analyze in this chapter the socio-historical tendencies which turned Germany into such a breeding ground and center of hostility to reason. Hence the following account of philosophico-historical tendencies must with a few exceptions such as Kierkegaard or Gobineau be confined to the German development. So far it and it alone has led to a Hitlerian movement. And hence, we believe, to confine ourselves to an account of the history of irrationalism in Germany is not to diminish the internationalism of it, but to heighten that aspect. It is a decidemoniety, a learn from this warning, addressed to the thinking persons of all nations. A warning that no philosophy is innocent or merely academic. That everywhere and always, the danger is objectively at hand that some global fire raiser will again spark off a devouring conflagration a la Hitler with the philosophical tinder of innocent salon conversations, cafe discussions, university lectures, literary supplements, essays, and so on. With the altered circumstances of today's world situation and their philosophical consequences, we shall occupy ourselves in the epilogue. They show far-reaching differences between the ideological spadework for the Second and the Third Imperialist World War. It seems, for reasons that will be examined in due course, that nowadays irrationalism in general does not play the leading role it had at the time that the Second World Inferno was organized, but we shall show that irrationalism still forms the philosophical climate, so to speak, of the new war propaganda. At least it plays no small part in it. Therefore present-day circumstances, though different in many respects, have by no means deprived of immediacy our intended caution to learn from the past. This is even less the case if we consider that a whole series of important elements in the classical irrationalism of the Hitler period, agnosticism, relativism, nihilism, proneness to myth-making, uncritical thinking, credulity, faith in miracles, racial prejudices, racial hatred, etc., etc., also play an undiminished, sometimes even stronger part in the philosophical propaganda of the Cold War. So today as well, although the struggles are being fought out with other immediate contents and methods than in Hitler's time, the main controversy philosophically speaking between progress and reaction is over the further evolution or destruction of reason. Hence we believe that today the significance of a history of the basic problems of irrationalism still points far beyond the merely historical realm from the lesson that Hitler taught the world. Each individual and each nation should try and learn something for their own good. And this responsibility exists in a particularly acute form for philosophers, whose duty it should be to supervise the existence and evolution of reason in proportion to their concrete share in social developments. but we must not overestimate their real significance in the development of society. They have neglected that duty both within and outside Germany. So far, not every country has seen the realization of Mephistopheles' lines about the desperate Faust, only look down on reason and science, the highest faculties of humankind, and then I have you trapped too. But, unless things take a new turn, this does not mean the slightest guarantee for any other land with an imperialist economy, or any other bourgeois culture, which is overshadowed by irrationalism, that it will not be taken over tomorrow by a fascist maniac compared to whom Hitler himself may have been only a clumsy novice. Thus the purpose of confining our analysis to Germany's development and German philosophy is to underline precisely this warning. Chapter 2. The founding of irrationalism in the period between